Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura Hanson with Connect My Brain. So glad that you're here during Dr. Hanson's case series. So what we're doing is we are looking at different cases that I've taken care of over the last 27 years and hopefully make some connections for different listeners out there, or maybe it's somebody that you know, and try to help people understand some bigger picture concepts. But also maybe you are going through this with your child and you didn't know that a place like Connect My Brain could help you with that. So today is a case on a history of strep. But the main reason that the child came into the office was for ADHD. And today, I think what we're really beginning to pick up is that there are many different things that are being tied to the ability to pay attention. I also look at it from another perspective, or adding into another perspective of how the brain actually gets developed. So in this particular case, let's just back up and see what kind of red flags we have in the history. And then let's move into what the assessment found. And then we'll connect some dots to, here's some research titled Neuropsychiatric Disorder Associated with Streptococcal Infection, a case control study among privately insured children. And in this particular research article, they talk about ADHD. And then we'll try to put our concepts together so that we can see how many layers are actually involved in this particular case. So if I start off with looking at the history, there really wasn't many things that were found that I would call typical big red flags. There's some little ones. There was an issue with the baby's kidney during pregnancy that was monitored, and everything turned out okay. There was also, when the baby was born, there was the use of formula, and there were prescribed prenatal vitamins. I would encourage any woman that is going to get pregnant to use a whole food-based prenatal vitamin. When we're talking about prescriptions, they're engineered, they're changed, and there's actually some evidence that is looking at the role of prescribed prenatals and the high incident of MTHFR, which is the enzyme for the methylation pathway, and we have such a high percentage of people that have this mutation, and it has to do with folate, which is the principal vitamin that they put women on when they're pregnant. But if we're having something that is more synthetically made, the environment is having perhaps an epigenetic change, and there is this possible correlation to this high rise in positive mutations on MTHFR. So those are, and then there was some things for the mom that would suggest endocrine issues. Okay, so there wasn't a ton of red flags in this particular case. More of the things occurred for me in looking at this child during the assessment. This was a child very well developed, involved in lots of activity. I might even venture to say I think there was perhaps too much, never stopping. I think that sometimes creates some anxiety in children. And when we look at the brain map, this child, when we were doing the eyes closed portion, we would expect this focus calm to increase, but it didn't. It really brought about a lot of anxiousness, which later I found out that the child had a really hard time being in the room alone in the dark. And this was a child that was about 10, 11 years old. And so that doesn't really match. A child by that time should be very comfortable in their own space. So those are the kinds of things that I begin to look at. And in fact, one of the other things that I found very interesting on a reassessment was the amount of agitation that the child demonstrated during the eyes closed portion of the brain mapping. And especially because the person had been in this office for a while and the issue is still going on at home. And so here's something that doesn't match age development, but seemed to really be a charge for this child. So in the typical realm of working on this child, I still take the same approach, mechanical chemical brain. So mechanically, there was an ability to acquire the skills very, very quickly. There was a greater amount of information I felt that came through on the brain map as well as the chemistry. And whenever I see that there is strep in somebody's history, I always want to get a strep antibody test, even if it's been one time. And some of the things that I've noticed is still, even to this day, most people believe that having strep is common. And so I want to almost help change the language that common doesn't mean normal. Common doesn't mean you should expect it. Can we have a lot of people that have different type of immune issues? And I would say absolutely. And so why do some people get sick and why do others don't? So those are the things that I look at when I'm trying to bring the picture together. We all have the ability to be healthy. We all have the ability to care for ourselves and fight viruses and bacteria. So again, why do some get sick and others do not? And this leads us into the real teaching in this particular podcast and hopefully the video to get to the YouTube channel. But again, we have to go back and understand the progression of how our bodies get wired up and how they function. So again, when you come into this world, you are fully formed, but you are not fully functioning. You have to engage in your environment in order to begin to build your immune system. Your immune system is going to be matured or having its greatest development by age 3. So these things that are going on between prior to pregnancy, delivery, the first 3 years of life are instrumental in having a picture of how that immune system is going to actually develop. Now, your gut, which is a big part of your immune system, that's actually going to mature by age 2. So just depending upon how were foods introduced, how did the child handle eating? Was the child a picky eater? Was the child engaged in the eating process? Did you let the child get messy? Let the child get messy. This is where it becomes tactile, it becomes very sensory, and you build more of your sensory after birth than you do inside of the womb. So what I've noticed in these cases that can be on a spectrum, and I'm not necessarily referring to autism. We've placed autism on a spectrum, but I think there's actually greater spectrums just about in anything that we see. So, for example, let's talk about strep for a minute. So, strep, you could have strep. Most people take an antibiotic, and your antibodies are low and everything is fine. So I'm going to put you low on the spectrum. You could be an individual that had strep a few times, antibiotics. These are typically broad spectrum antibiotics, which mean, unfortunately, they're going to wipe out the whole microbiome. And if it's not rebuilt, we could start to be going into some other issues, some things that probably about 10, 12, maybe even 13 years ago, they were guessing that strep had a lot to do with PANDAS, which is an autoimmune neurodevelopmental acquired syndrome in the pediatric population. Now they know that strep is a huge part of it. Now, you could also have other viruses still lingering around and other bacteria. So we're beginning to open up that picture to what we're going to call a neuroimmune system, because these illnesses are happening at pivotal times when the windows of development are open, and what's going on in the immune system is impacting how the brain is becoming wired. Remember, we all have the same stuff up here in our brain, but it's based on our experience about how things are going to get wired up. So, for example, the right side of your brain is what calms the immune system. The left side of your brain is what is going to turn the immune system on so that it goes to fight whatever it needs to fight. The hard part about this is that you can't just make a guess if somebody has really high strep antibodies or has had several bouts of strep and used antibiotics. You can't necessarily just go, well, that must mean that the immune system never came on, and therefore it's probably the right side of the brain. Or the immune system is just constantly on, and the immune system does not know how to go in and fight its battles. That's not enough of clinical information to tell you if we're dealing with immune suppression or immune overactivation. We never take one piece and just decide, especially in the pediatric population. So just depending upon where these individuals fall on the spectrum. So again, it could have been one time, it could have been several times. And unfortunately, the children that have a tendency to be diagnosed PANDAS or PANS, they typically are the highest on the spectrum, meaning that they're in an autoimmune storm. But we're now starting to really be able to see that everything really has a spectrum. You could now have strep in your history, and other things that are common that you can see right here in our article is tics and Tourette's syndrome. Those are very common. But did we know that we also had the ADHD and depression? I'm not even going to put a label of major depressive disorder because I think that's an injustice. Right now, I can tell you, I find it almost rare now to have a history that doesn't include someone having strep because it is common. In fact, this is November 22nd, 2022, depending upon when you might hear this, but just a few weeks ago, there seemed to be an outbreak of strep at the school level. So again, were all these children, why were they impacted? Are they impacted because their own immune system is not functioning at the highest level? Are they battling stress and anxiety? And we keep talking about it, and I am going to keep talking about it. The last 2.5 years, and we're not done. We have put so much on our pediatric population, and now we have increased the vaccine mandate again to include the COVID vaccine for children in their typical protocol. In some places, they're still masking. In some places, they're still locking down. At some point, when do you start actually addressing the immune system in order to bring a greater health to a community? So start with yourself and your family and your children and realize that you can improve your immune response. But if these kids have battled stuff during these open windows of development, there is a deeper rooted issue that literally you have to pick up the rock, you have to look at it, you have to test it, you have to know what is the problem, and then you have to go after resolving it. So here I've got a individual who is very athletically inclined, but on edge, very irritated all the time, scared of things, doesn't want to be found out, and also carrying around an issue of you're having trouble paying attention. So when I look at the big picture and trying to work on the brain, paying attention, we've talked about this, also is connected to that Moro reflex. And one thing that I want to describe about these primitive reflexes, Moro is AKA startle response, meaning that you have a heightened response basically to your environment. You can also have that environment internal as well as external. It regulates the arousal mechanism that first is what stimulates that baby to wake up and have somebody pay attention to them. And then we take our little toddler on a journey to teach them how to take care of themselves, like potty training. And then as we get older and we're school age, we have the ability to pay attention to others. This reflex is also about monitoring how much oxygen and CO2 that you have available. So when we're in this stress response, which if I'm high anxiety and always performing, I also have a heightened internal compass of stress, then my oxygen and my CO2 are going to be dysregulated. When I did that part on the assessment, we started off at a pulse ox of 98 and a pulse of 83. After a 3-minute test, oxygen actually went down to 96, heart rate went up to 116. We would never expect the oxygen to go down. So here's an individual who's athletically inclined, but cannot deliver oxygen to the most distal ends of the body in a proficient manner. So then let's just fast forward a little bit. We put a mask on them, which also depletes the oxygen level. And within 20 seconds, if you don't have the rate of oxygen that you should have, you are in another stress response. And these things they start taking off like a loop. The 5-minute test, we got 98 for oxygen and a heart rate of 132. I like that the oxygen went up to 98, but I don't like that the heart rate went up. After 5 minutes of aerobic activity, that's when your cardiovascular system should normalize. This is one of the tests that helps me look at the child's endurance level. Have you ever asked yourself or said to yourself, I have no margins. I'm at my end. It's kind of like the piece of paper, like a loose leaf notebook paper with the red margins on the side. You're all the way to the end, ready to fall off. This is what happens even to children. And so this too can raise their irritability. The reflexes are the rudimentary place of all learning. So if our bucket gets filled, it's never going to be, well, it can be just one thing. It could be like a traumatic brain injury. It could be an emotional breakdown. Absolutely. One thing can tip your bucket. But the typical thing that we see is that people have many things in their history. So for that child, it's going to be the neuroimmune. It's going to be the potential of the gut health because of formula. And then there is some anxiety for whatever reason, wherever that started. And that actually started before we went into the situation we were in 2.5 years ago. So where did that anxiousness come from? Maybe it's because there was the push to perform. And of course, our children want to please us. And always remember, they don't have a point of reference to tell you, hey, this is pushing my margins. And then sometimes we have language back to our kids like, no pain, no gain. You can do it no matter what. But sometimes we're missing the very cues that are saying it's too much. A simple cardiovascular test is telling me there's the possibility it's too much. And lots of times, children that are more performers, they can do well in the typical mechanical movements, but when those challenges like cardiovascular and then measuring timing, and again, we use the interactive metronome, and we are literally quantifiably measuring timing, looking at both hands, cross crawl patterns, balance, and then adding guide sounds, meaning if you're a little fast, the pitch of the bell is different. If you're a little slow, the pitch of the bell is different. In this particular situation, the initial assessment, remember, we want that score to be under 100. It means you're more accurate. So both hands, 93. That's a good score. Left hand, right foot, 76. That's a very good score. Right hand, left foot, 89. Very good score. Balance on the right, 298. Balance on the left, 329. So that jumps off the page, right? So when you put me on one foot an unstable surface, that's how hard you have to push me to tip me over. And that's really what this means in this particular assessment. The great stuff was about 6 months after all of this and redoing that particular test, the scores are phenomenal. So both hands, 37. Cross crawl left, 39. Cross crawl right, 63. Balance, 43 on both sides. And guide sounds, 37 that were 112. So there were definitely changes that were made. So the high point that I bring this to, is it going to stick? And the chances are in this particular situation, it won't. Because there's an underlying neuroimmune problem that I did not get to address. And I tried, but I didn't get to address. So we did a strep antibody test. And the antibodies came back 291. And then the second test so that was antidenase B was 291. Anti-streptolysin O, 687. Those numbers, in my opinion, I'm only comfortable 130 and below. That's a big deal. And we don't start right out of the gate working on trying to pull this out of a child, because the thing I want to do is I want to restore normal gut health, normal elimination, normal detoxification. Then you take a look, where are you after that? If they can't do it for themselves, then we will absolutely step in and we have a complete homeopathic protocol that will address clearing the body. But that too takes some time. And unfortunately, I didn't get that kind of time in this case. Here's a child that could put the mechanical pieces together very well. In real time, the neurofeedback, that was fine. But there was still this excessive reaction, this irritability that didn't match. And so I thought about bringing this case to the table and then find that this is something that is really already being identified. Kids that are labeled, or perhaps we suspect that they have trouble with attention. What do they have in their history of illnesses, viral and bacterial? What ages did they occur? What happened during the pregnancy? What is the health of mom and dad? That impacts the development of your baby. So we look at this and then we follow the body. The body is not a system that jumps in right out of the gate and detoxifies something. You have to prepare the body so that it can do it more efficiently. If it can't get the toxins out, many of them are reabsorbed, and many children simply regress even more. So I encourage you, if this is in your child's background, that you take a look at it and realize it's not just an antibiotic that can be on the or be part of the management program to look at this. Now, if our traditional healthcare model would literally engineer an antibiotic to address strep that would be far safer than how we do go about things. Most of the time, unfortunately, it's the insurance companies making decisions about what doctors' offices, hospitals can and cannot do. And these individuals are not educated. It all comes down to the bottom line. This is why there has been a turn, for probably 2 decades, for providers to go back into more of a functional level, looking at the chemistry, looking at the health of the gut, looking at the elimination system, looking at a couple of genes like MTHFR. And I would encourage you, be careful. Don't just jump online and order a genetic test. Do it privately. This is your personal information and it is worth protecting. So let's bring this picture together. Many children today are identified as having some kind of attention issue. We've talked in our last podcast about even fatigue has now been brought into the differential diagnosis associated with a inability or having a hard time paying attention. This is a second thing in our differential diagnosis is what is the neuroimmune system? What is in the background? What has this child experienced? When did this child experience it? And what is happening with it today? Take the time to work through a process of healing. Don't just jump to the bottom line. Go about it from a standpoint of following how the body does things. Do it safely. Get guidance. You are always welcome to go over to the website and fill out a little form that says, I just want some information. I'll set up a time. You and I will have a personal conversation. If you can let me know your availability in that lead, then I will be able to narrow down how fast I can get in touch with you. You can also call the office, and I'm happy to schedule a time to chat with you. The office number is 678-501-5172. The website is connectmybrain.com. This is an incredible world of information out there, and I am doing everything I can to bring it to my community. Many of you might hear this after Thanksgiving, but it is Thanksgiving week. And from the bottom of my heart to yours, be blessed and happy Thanksgiving.